The sound that dragged me from the depths of a dreamless, vaguely beer-scented sleep wasn't an alarm clock. It was something far more sinister. Beep, beep, beep. It was the high-pitched, insistent cry of a large vehicle reversing. A sound that, in the hushed sanctuary of Maple Creek Estates at 8 a.m., is the suburban equivalent of an air raid siren. My first thought, filtered through the cotton wadding in my brain, was panic. My car. They're repossessing my 2011 Corolla, but I own it outright. Did I get 1,000 parking tickets in my sleep? I rolled out of bed, my joints cracking a protest, and stumbled to the window. Peeking through the cheap plastic blinds, I saw it. It wasn't my loyal beige Corolla being threatened. It was something much bigger. A tow truck, one of those hulking flatbed behemoths that look like they eat smaller cars for breakfast, was angling itself in front of my driveway. Its yellow lights strobed silently, painting my perfectly manicured lawn in sickly flashes of impending doom, and its target, the object of its metallic desire, was the sea serpent. The sea serpent was my grandfather's boat. A glorious 24-foot monument to 1980s fiberglass engineering, currently resting on a slightly rusted trailer in my driveway, where it had been since I'd inherited it 2 months ago. It was a beautiful thing, if you squinted and appreciated the poetic qualities of peeling paint and a faint, lingering aroma of fish and old vinyl. To me, it was a legacy. To the rest of Maple Creek Estates, it was apparently a public nuisance on par with a chemical spill. I didn't even bother with shoes. Stained gray sweatpants and a t-shirt with a faded logo for a tech company that had laid me off 3 months prior would have to be my battle armor. I burst out the front door, the manicured grass cool beneath my bare feet. "Hey, whoa, buddy! What do you think you're doing?" The driver, a man whose neck was wider than my ambitions, leaned out of his cab. He had a look of profound, almost spiritual boredom on his face, as if towing away the last vestiges of a man's family history was as mundane as picking up his dry cleaning. "Got a work order," he grunted, not even bothering to make eye contact. He gestured with a greasy thumb toward a clipboard on his passenger seat. "Says here, unauthorized long-term vehicle storage. Also says it's a," he squinted at the paper, "derelict vessel." Derelict? The word stung more than it should have. She's not derelict, she's vintage, she has character, and I'm not storing her, I'm admiring her from my living room. It's a great view. The driver, whose name tag read Stan, was unmoved. "Don't matter to me what you call it. Orders from the Homeowners Association. I hook it, I tow it. Simple." He started to lower the flatbed with a hydraulic groan, a sound that vibrated right through my soul. This was it. I was about to lose my grandfather's boat because it didn't match the neighborhood's officially sanctioned palette of grege, off-grege, and slightly darker grege. And then, as if summoned by the screech of metal, she appeared. Brenda Fromm. She strode across my lawn like a pint-sized paten, clad in a pastel pink tracksuit, a sun visor, and wielding a clipboard like a weapon of mass destruction. Brenda was the president of the Maple Creek Estates HOA, a position she held with the sort of iron-fisted zeal usually reserved for dictators of small, unstable countries. She lived 2 doors down and communicated exclusively through passive-aggressive newsletters and laminated notices she'd slip under your door for infractions, like leaving your garbage bin out for 3 extra minutes. "Jerry," she said, her smile so tight it looked painful. "I was hoping we could avoid this." "Then maybe you shouldn't have called in the vulture squad, Brenda," I shot back, gesturing at Stan's truck. "You've had 3 notices," she said, tapping her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "The bylaws are quite clear. Section C, paragraph 4. All recreational vehicles, including but not limited to campers, trailers, and watercraft, must be stored in a garage or an approved off-site facility. This eyesore, she waved a dismissive hand at the sea serpent, has been lowering property values for 63 days. It's not an eyesore. It's a piece of my family's history, I pleaded, my voice cracking a little. My grandpa taught me how to fish on that boat. He claimed he caught a legendary catfish from it once, a monster he named Old Finless. That's a lovely anecdote, Jerry, she said, her voice dripping with counterfeit sympathy. The neighborhood covenants, however, do not have a sentimental clause. They exist to maintain aesthetic harmony and protect our collective investment. Stan had started unspooling a thick, greasy winch cable. The metallic clink-clank of the hook against the pavement was a death knell. I was cornered. My mind raced, frantically searching for an escape. Legal action? I couldn't afford a lawyer. Pleading? Brenda's heart was a tiny, dried-up rock of potpourri. Hiding the boat? I couldn't exactly stuff it in my hall closet. My eyes darted around the sterile, perfect landscape. The identical houses with their identical mailboxes, the chemically green lawns, the ornamental, non-fruit-bearing pear trees that lined the street in a perfect, soulless row. It was an exhibit of suburban conformity, an exhibit. The word echoed in the desperate, empty halls of my brain. An idea, a glorious, stupid, magnificent idea, bloomed in the barren soil of my panic. It was an idea so audacious, so profoundly dumb that it just might work. I held up a hand, a gesture of such sudden authority that Stan actually paused, his hand hovering over the winch controls. Stop. I walked over to the sea serpent and placed a hand on its cool, peeling hull, as if knighting it. I took a deep breath, puffed out my chest, and turned to face Brenda, my face a mask of newfound, unhinged confidence. You can't tow it, I stated, my voice steady. Brenda's paper-thin smile faltered. And why is that, exactly? I gave her a look that I hoped conveyed both artistic genius and pity for her limited worldview. Because, I said, letting the word hang in the air for a dramatic beat, it's not a boat. Stan and Brenda exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. Stan scratched his head. Brenda's brow furrowed, creating tiny cracks in her foundation. Jerry, are you feeling all right? She asked. It is very clearly a boat. I let out a small, condescending chuckle. That's what a layperson might see, Brenda. But you're failing to grasp the artistic context. This isn't a vehicle to be towed. I gestured grandly with both hands, as if unveiling the Mona Lisa. It's the centerpiece of a new installation. It's art. Silence. The only sound was a bird chirping in one of the soulless pear trees, probably chirping about HOA regulations. Brenda's eyes narrowed. Art? Precisely, I declared, feeling a surge of adrenaline. The lie was growing, taking on a life of its own. It's a powerful statement piece. It's the permanent land-based nautical exhibit. Stan just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. Brenda's face cycled through a series of emotions. Confusion, then irritation, then a deep, simmering rage that made her pink tracksuit seem to glow with an inner heat. She was legally stymied, at least for the moment. Towing a vehicle was one thing. Towing a piece of art from a designated exhibit, that was a whole different and potentially litigious can of worms. She snapped her clipboard against her thigh. This is ridiculous. You haven't heard the last of this, Jerry. She spun on her heel and power-walked back to her beige fortress, defeated for now. Stan looked at me, then at the boat, then back at me. He shrugged, reeled in his winch cable, and climbed back into his cab. The vulture had been repelled. As the truck rumbled away, I stood alone on my lawn, barefoot in my stained sweatpants, next to a peeling fishing boat that was now, apparently, a work of high art. My heart was pounding. I had no idea what I was doing, but I had just won the first battle, and it felt absolutely, terrifyingly, gloriously magnificent. The moment the tow truck turned the corner, my triumphant adrenaline rush evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that whispered, "What have you done?" I scrambled back inside, locked the door, and did what any modern man does in a crisis. I grabbed my phone and called my voice of reason. "Dave, you are not going to believe this," I said, pacing a rut into my living room carpet. "Let me guess," came Dave's painfully pragmatic voice from the other end. "You finally organized your sock drawer?" Dave has been my best friend since college. He's an accountant. His idea of a wild Friday night is finding a rounding error in a spreadsheet. He is the polar opposite of my current life choices. No, better. The HOA tried to tow Grandpa's boat. Oh man, I'm sorry. I told you Brenda Fromm was basically a Bond villain in tennis shoes. So, where'd they take it? I took a deep breath. They didn't. I stopped them. How? Did you chain yourself to it? I've seen that in movies. Very dramatic. No, I said, stopping my pacing to admire the sea serpent through the window. It looked different now. More profound. I told them it wasn't a boat. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his analytical brain. "Jerry, I'm looking at a picture of it right now. The one you sent me. It has a hull, a deck, and the word boat is literally in the name of the object. It's a boat." "Not anymore," I said, beaming with pride. "It's now the permanent land-based nautical exhibit. It's a bold statement on the duality of freedom and confinement in modern suburbia." The silence that followed was so profound, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, a long, weary sigh traveled through the phone. "Let me get this straight. You are fighting the HOA, an organization with lawyers and infinite time to make your life miserable by telling them your rotting fishing boat is an art installation?" "It doesn't rot, Dave, it patinates," I corrected him. "And yes, that's the plan." "You're going to get fined into oblivion," he said, his voice a flat line of certainty. "They'll put a lien on your house. They'll force you to paint your mailbox beige." "Not if it's a legitimate exhibit, my friend," I said, the unhinged confidence returning. "Not if it's official." I hung up before he could talk any more sense into me. He was right, of course. My verbal declaration was just a temporary shield. I needed to build a fortress. I needed to wrap my ridiculous lie in so many layers of official-looking nonsense that Brenda's brain would short-circuit. I hadn't had a real project since the layoff. Now, I had a mission. The next 48 hours were a blur of creative fury. My background was in web development, and for the first time in months I felt a spark of my old professional self. I fired up my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my determined face in the darkened room. First, the website. I bought the domain name maxwellnauticalexhibit.org. The .org was key. It implied a non-profit educational status. I built a simple, elegant one-page site with a stark black background and white text. The font was Helvetica Neue, clean, modern, museum quality. I wrote a mission statement that would have made my old English professor weep with either pride or despair. The Maxwell Nautical Exhibit is a permanent, site-specific installation dedicated to exploring the liminal space between mobility and stasis. The sea serpent serves as a tangible metaphor for the journeys we dream of versus the shores we find ourselves tethered to. It challenges the viewer to question the very definition of place in a transient world. I created an About the Artist page with a moody, black-and-white photo of myself I took in my bathroom mirror, trying to look pensive. I wrote a bio that mentioned my lifelong fascination with aquatic folklore and my post-digital artistic sensibilities. It was complete, utter nonsense, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever created. Next, the physical manifestation, the sign. A temporary hand-scrawled sign wouldn't do. It had to look official. I spent 3 hours in a big box office supply store, agonizing over materials. I finally settled on a sheet of brushed aluminum composite. I designed the placard on my computer using the same Helvetica font and paid a premium for rush printing at a local sign shop. The next morning, armed with a hammer and a fresh sense of purpose, I performed the installation ceremony. The metal stake slid into the soft turf of my front lawn with a satisfying thump. I stepped back to admire my work. The sun glinted off the brushed aluminum. The Sea Serpent, a study in landlocked liberation, circa 1988. Mixed media, fiberglass, rust, memories. Artist Jerry Maxwell. Maxwell Nautical exhibit. Hours by appointment only. It was perfect. To complete the effect, I drove to the hardware store and bought 3 cheap solar-powered spotlights. As dusk fell, I positioned them around the boat, casting dramatic, moody shadows across its hull. It no longer looked like a boat in a driveway. It looked like a statement. A weird, confusing statement, but a statement nonetheless. My little bubble of artistic triumph was burst the next afternoon by a slow, deliberate knock on my door. I peered through the peephole. A police car was parked at my curb. Great. Brenda had gone nuclear. I opened the door to find 2 officers standing on my porch. One was older, with a face carved from years of dealing with nonsense and a mustache that had seen things. His name tag read Miller. The other was younger, with a fresh-faced look and eyes that were crinkling at the corners, a telltale sign he was fighting a losing battle against laughter. His tag said Rodriguez. "Jerry Maxwell?" Officer Miller asked, his voice a gravelly monotone. "That's me," I said, stepping out and casually positioning myself between them and my exhibit, like a human shield of artistic integrity. "How can I help you, officers?" "We received a call from a Miss Brenda Fromm," Miller said, consulting a small notepad. "She reported an unlicensed, derelict vehicle parked on a residential lawn, in violation of City Ordinance 34B. I feigned thoughtful confusion. "A vehicle? That's strange. The only thing on my lawn is my new art installation." I gestured dramatically towards the Sea Serpent and its shiny new sign. "The Maxwell Nautical exhibit. Perhaps you've heard of it? We just had our soft opening." Miller and Rodriguez both turned to look. Their eyes took in the boat, now dramatically uplit by the faint glow of the solar lights that were just beginning to kick in. They read the sign. Then they read it again. Rodriguez turned his head and coughed, a sound that was suspiciously close to a snort of laughter. Miller, to his credit, remained stone-faced. He walked over to the sign, crouched down to read it carefully, and then stood up, stroking his mustache. He looked at the boat. He looked at me. He looked at the perfect, identical houses surrounding us. "An exhibit, huh?" he said. "It's a commentary," I said, now fully in character as the pretentious artist-curator. "It explores the dichotomy of suburban existence. The boat represents the desire for escape, for adventure. The lawn represents the comfortable yet confining reality of our daily lives. It's meant to be provocative." Officer Rodriguez was now staring very intently at his shoes, his shoulders shaking slightly. Miller sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that carried the weight of 1,000 stupid neighborhood disputes. "Son, your neighbor says you have a boat parked on your lawn." "Officer, with all due respect," I said, lowering my voice to a confidential tone. "This is a designated cultural landmark. It's conceptually no different than the town's ridiculous statue of a giant ear of corn downtown. It's just that my piece has significantly more historical gravitas, in my humble opinion." Miller stared at me for a long, silent moment. I could see the gears turning. He could cite me, which would involve a mountain of paperwork over something profoundly stupid. Or he could leave. He chose the path of least resistance. "Look," he said finally, tucking his notepad away. "The city ordinances are about vehicles. If you want to call this thing art, I guess that's your First Amendment right, for now." He jabbed a thumb towards the grass. "Just make sure you keep your lawn mowed neatly around your exhibit. Don't give her any other reason to call us." Rodriguez, finally losing his battle for composure, muttered into his radio, "Yeah, control situation is artistic. Code 4. Advise complainant it appears to be a civil matter." As they walked back to their car, I heard Rodriguez say, "A study in landlocked liberation?" And Miller's weary reply, "Don't ask, kid. Just drive." They left. I had faced down the law, and the law had shrugged and walked away. I wasn't just a guy with a boat anymore. I was a legitimate, police-acknowledged artist. The game had just leveled up, and I was starting to think I might actually be able to win. The victory over Officers Miller and Rodriguez was intoxicating. It was one thing to outmaneuver a power-walking HOA president. It was another entirely to have the local police implicitly validate my nonsense. But I knew Brenda wouldn't give up. She was probably at home, poring over bylaws and drafting new, more draconian rules about lawn art. My defense couldn't be static. It had to evolve. The exhibit had to become more of an exhibit, more absurd, more undeniable. My next thought was, what do all legitimate exhibits have? They have infrastructure, they have presentation. My boat was just sitting on a trailer. It looked temporary. I needed to make it look permanent. I needed to elevate it, both literally and figuratively. I needed a contractor. I pulled up a local search on my phone and scrolled past the polished, professional-looking companies until I found a listing that felt right. Gus's General Contracting and Odd Jobs. The slogan sealed the deal. "If it's dumb but you'll pay, I'm your guy." This was my man. I dialed the number. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Gus." "Hi, Gus. My name is Jerry Maxwell. I have a unique project I was hoping to discuss." "I don't do plumbing on Sundays," he grunted. "It's not plumbing, it's more structural and artistic." There was a skeptical silence. "Define artistic." "I need a platform," I said. "A dais, if you will, a pedestal for a boat." Another pause. I could hear him breathing. "A platform for a boat. Is this boat in the water?" No, it's in my driveway." "You want me to build a wooden platform for a boat. That's in your driveway." "Precisely," I said, encouraged. "It needs to elevate the piece, you know? Give it presence. Make it clear that it's not just parked, it's presented." "Son," Gus said, his voice a gravelly mix of pity and curiosity. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've built a deck for a guy's prize-winning pig, and I once soundproofed a basement for a dude who played the bagpipes. This is a new one." He sighed heavily. "I'll come by tomorrow morning. There's going to be a surcharge for weird." Gus arrived the next day in a pickup truck that looked like it had personally survived a war. He was a man built of compressed sawdust and cynicism, with a tool belt that hung on his hips with the comfortable familiarity of a gunfighter's holster. He walked a slow circle around the sea serpent, stroking a chin that was as rough as sandpaper. "So this is the art," he said. It wasn't a question. "This is her," I said proudly. "Huh," he grunted. He kicked one of the trailer's tires. "All right. Pressure-treated pine, 4x4 posts sunk in concrete, 2x8 joists. You want stairs? Of course, it has to be accessible for viewing. Right, viewing. He scribbled some numbers on a pad. It'll take me and my boy 2 days. It'll cost you more than the boat's worth. Art is priceless, Gus. He gave me a look that said he wholeheartedly disagreed. Cash up front for materials. The next 2 days were a symphony of suburban chaos. The peaceful hum of Maple Creek Estates was shattered by the whine of a circular saw, the rhythmic thud of hammers, and the sound of Gus yelling at his teenage son, who seemed to be communicating entirely through shrugs. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination. Brenda's blinds were drawn tight, but I could feel her rage radiating from the house like heat. Dave showed up on the first afternoon, a 6-pack of beer in his hand and a look of profound resignation on his face. I can't believe you're actually doing this, he said, handing me a cold one. It's all about commitment to the concept, my friend, I said, watching as Gus expertly sank another post. You can't just say it's an exhibit. You have to make it an exhibit. It looks like you're building a sacrificial altar for a fishing boat, he noted. He stayed for 3 hours, shaking his head the entire time, but he also held a support beam steady when Gus needed an extra hand. That's friendship. By the end of the second day, it was complete. A beautiful, sturdy wooden deck about a foot off the ground now completely encased the boat trailer. A small 3-step staircase led up to the platform. It was magnificent. As Gus was packing up his tools, I brought out the finishing touches I'd ordered online. What in God's name is that? Gus asked, pointing at the box in my hands. It's a velvet rope, I said, pulling out 2 chrome stanchions and a plush red cord. For crowd control. Gus just stared at me, then at his truck. I'm leaving now. Wait, I said. One more thing. I held up a small wooden box with a slit in the top that I'd bought at a craft store. Could you mount this on the railing? It's a donation box for the exhibit's upkeep and future acquisitions. Gus let out a sound that was half laugh, half groan. He took the box, drilled it into the railing with 2 quick, violent zaps of his impact driver, and threw his hands up. All right, I'm done. Don't call me again unless your art starts floating away. That evening, I stood on my porch and admired my creation. The solar spotlights hit the boat, which now sat proudly on its new pedestal, cordoned off by a velvet rope. It was a masterpiece of defiant absurdity. It was then that I saw her. A woman I didn't recognize was wrestling a large, flat-packed IKEA box out of the back of a U-Haul parked across the street. She was my new neighbor, and her first impression of Maple Creek Estates was my driveway masterpiece. Perfect. Summoning my courage, I walked over. Need a hand with that? It looks like a Swedish torture device. She looked up, wiping a strand of brown hair from her forehead. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that were currently surveying my lawn with an expression of deep and profound confusion. Thanks, but I think I've got it, she said, giving the box one last heave onto the dolly. I'm Sarah, by the way, just moving in. Jerry, I said, extending a hand. Welcome to the neighborhood. Sorry about the, construction. Her eyes drifted back to my driveway. No, it's fine. I'm just trying to figure out what exactly I'm looking at over there. Is that a boat on a stage? This was my moment, the first official tour. It's a common misconception, I said smoothly, slipping into my curator persona. It's actually the Maxwell Nautical exhibit. Would you care for a tour? There's no charge on weekdays. A slow smile spread across her face. She was intrigued. You're serious? Art is always serious, I said gravely. Come on. I led her across the street, unclipped the velvet rope with a flourish, and gestured for her to ascend the small staircase. She stepped onto the platform, her smile widening. "So," she said, running a hand along the dusty hull of the sea serpent, "tell me about the art." "Well," I began, pointing to a large, spidery network of cracks in the fiberglass near the bow. "This section here is titled Fractured Horizons. It represents the shattered dreams of a generation adrift in a sea of economic uncertainty." "Wow," she said, her voice laced with amusement. "Deep." "And this gash here," I pointed to a jagged scar on the side, "that's from the legendary Battle of Catfish Creek back in '92. My grandfather, the artist's progenitor, fought a creature the size of a Buick. The fish got away, but the memory, as you can see, remains etched into the medium." "The artist's progenitor?" she laughed. "You are completely full of it." "That's what the critics said about Picasso," I countered, trying to keep a straight face. "And finally, this persistent rust patch on the trailer hitch? That symbolizes the slow, inevitable decay of the American industrial complex. It's very poignant." She was openly laughing now, a genuine, hearty laugh that echoed in the quiet street. "Okay, Jerry the curator. I'm a lawyer. And I have to say, this is the most creative and legally ambiguous use of a front lawn I have ever seen. I'm impressed." We talked for another 20 minutes. She had a quick wit and a healthy appreciation for the absurd. It was the best conversation I'd had in months. As the days turned into a week, the exhibit became an institution. The neighborhood was officially divided into 2 camps. Team Brenda, who would scowl and pointedly look away whenever they passed my house, and Team Jerry, who would give me a thumbs up or a knowing smile. A couple of high school kids started taking their prom photos in front of the boat. Someone, I suspect it was Dave, anonymously left a $5 bill in the donation box. I was no longer just a weirdo. I was a local folk hero, but I knew the peace couldn't last. Every time I looked over at Brenda's house, I could see the blinds twitch. She wasn't just watching. She was plotting. The Cold War of Maple Creek Estates was about to heat up. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not in the regular mail, but via a courier who required a signature. That's how you know it's bad news. The envelope was thick, creamy, and expensive feeling. The return address was for a downtown law firm. Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Okay, I made that last part up, but it was something equally soulless. My stomach did a little flip-flop. This was it. Brenda had unsheathed her claws. I slit the envelope open with a butter knife. The paper inside was even heavier, with a letterhead that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. And the words were a deluge of legal jargon designed to intimidate and confuse. Cease and desist. Breach of restrictive covenants. Unapproved permanent structure. Unlicensed business operation. They cited not only HOA bylaws, but also city ordinances I didn't know existed. It was a multi-front assault on my artistic freedom. The final paragraph was the kill shot. I had 14 calendar days from the date of receipt to dismantle the unapproved structure, remove the derelict vessel from the premises, and restore the property to its original, approved condition. Failure to comply would result in daily fines, legal action, and a lien placed on my house. The confidence that had been buoying me for weeks deflated like a cheap pool float. This wasn't a laminated notice I could laugh off. This was real. This was lawyers. These were people who charged $500 an hour to write sentences with the word heretofore in them. My grand, absurd gesture was about to cost me my home. I immediately called Dave. "They sent the hounds, man," I said, my voice tight with panic. "I got a letter from their lawyers. 14 days. They're calling it an unlicensed business operation. The donation box, Dave exclaimed. I knew that was a bridge too far. You accepted commerce. You're a business now, Jerry. It was $17.50, Dave. I haven't even taken it out of the box. Doesn't matter. To them, you're running a for-profit museum on your lawn. I told you this would happen, he said. But the usual I told you so smugness was gone from his voice. It was replaced by genuine concern. So what's the plan? You gotta take it down, right? It was a good run. I can't, I said, looking out the window at the sea serpent, standing so proudly on its pedestal. It had become more than a boat. It was a symbol. If I back down now, Brenda wins. She'll be unstoppable. Next, she'll be regulating the color of our garden gnomes. Jerry, she already regulates the color of our garden gnomes. It's in the summer newsletter. Earth tones only. Defeated, I hung up and sat on my couch. The threatening letter lying on the coffee table like a dead animal. I was staring at it, trying to will it to combust, when I heard a knock. It was Sarah from across the street, holding a plate of brownies. Housewarming gift for myself, but I made way too many, she said, her smile faltering when she saw my face. Whoa, you look like you just saw a ghost? Worse, I said, pointing at the letter. I saw a lawyer. I invited her in, and she put the brownies down, immediately picking up the letter. As a lawyer herself, she read it with a professional, discerning eye, her brow furrowed in concentration. She paced my living room, just as I had, but with a lot more purpose. Okay, she said after reading it twice. This is aggressive, but it's also full of holes. My head snapped up. It is? Absolutely. They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. Derelict vessel. That's subjective. You call it art. Unlicensed business. That donation box is a problem. You should get rid of it. But their main argument, their strongest one, is this. She tapped a paragraph. Permanent, unapproved structure. The platform? I whispered. The platform, she confirmed. That's the one that violates city code, not just HOA rules. That's their hammer. So I'm screwed. Not necessarily, she said, a glint in her eye I was coming to really appreciate. Their entire case rests on the idea that this is a permanent installation. Your defense has been that it's art, but you're missing a key component. Art needs an audience. It needs an event. You can't just declare something a museum. You have to, museum. The gears in my head started to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. What are you saying? I'm saying their case is about a permanent structure for a private exhibit. But what if it wasn't private? And what if it wasn't permanent? What if it was a temporary public event? She smiled. I'm saying you need to throw a party. The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. It was perfect. It was brilliant. It was even more insane than anything I had come up with yet. A grand opening, I said, the words tasting like victory. Exactly, Sarah said. A one-time only cultural event. You file for a simple block party permit from the city. You invite the whole neighborhood. You make it a charity thing, so it looks good. It's not a permanent structure, it's temporary staging for a public gala. The despair I'd felt just minutes before was replaced by a familiar, manic energy. I was back in the game. The next week was a whirlwind. I officially removed the donation box. Then I got to work planning. I went down to City Hall and filed for a permit for a neighborhood community gathering and canned food drive. The clerk barely looked up. Permit granted. Then came the invitations. I used my web design skills to create a genuinely classy-looking flyer. You are cordially invited to the grand opening gala of the Maxwell Nautical exhibit. a one-night-only cultural event celebrating suburban art and community spirit. Join us for an evening of light refreshment, contemplative art, and neighborly conversation. Saturday, September 12th. Sundown. Please bring a non-perishable food item for the local food bank. I printed 100 of them and walked the neighborhood, placing one in every mailbox, including Brenda's. I even posted one on the community bulletin board at the entrance to Maple Creek Estates. The day after the flyers went out, I was watering a potted plant on my porch when Brenda stormed over, a copy of the invitation crumpled in her fist. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, her face the color of a ripe tomato. "It's an invitation, Brenda," I said cheerfully. "I'm holding a community event for charity. We'd love to have you. Feel free to bring a can of green beans." "This will not happen, Jerry," she said, her voice a low growl. "This is a clear violation. You are flaunting the legal notice. I will have the sheriff's department here." "Great," I said, my smile unwavering. "The more the merrier. They can donate to the food drive. After all, Brenda," I leaned in conspiratorially, "you're not against charity and community spirit, are you? That would look awfully bad for the HOA president." She was so furious, she was speechless. She just stood there, vibrating with impotent rage, before spinning on her heel and marching back to her house. The date of the gala was set for Saturday, September 12th, the day before my 14-day deadline expired. Everything was coming down to one single, ridiculous night. It was no longer just about my boat. It was about art, loopholes, and the sacred right to be a weirdo in a world of beige. And I was going to throw the best damn art gala a suburban driveway had ever seen. The morning of September 12th dawned with a kind of tense, cinematic beauty. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, and the air held the first, faint hint of autumn. It was the perfect day for a showdown. My stomach was a churning pit of anxiety and cheap coffee. I had spent the morning setting up. 2 folding tables were draped in plastic tablecloths, one holding a large punch bowl filled with a disconcertingly red liquid and a platter of store-brand cookies, the other for collecting the canned goods. Dave came over around noon, surveyed the scene, and shook his head. "This is the most pathetic gala I've ever seen," he said, adjusting a drooping tablecloth. "Where's the string quartet?" "Budget cuts," I said, trying to straighten the ridiculously oversized ceremonial ribbon I had taped across the entrance to the exhibit's platform. "Plus, the thrift store was fresh out of cellists." My bravado was a thin veneer. What if no one came? What if it was just me, Dave, and a bowl of rapidly warming punch? What if Brenda showed up with an actual court order and a team of SWAT officers? My fears were partially allayed around 5 p.m. when a white van with a local news station logo pulled up and parked across the street. A reporter and a cameraman got out. Sarah, who had apparently made an anonymous call about a unique human interest story concerning a local artist's battle against a restrictive HOA, gave me a discreet thumbs up from her porch. This was a game changer. The presence of a camera gave me a shield of public opinion. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, people started to arrive. At first, it was just a trickle. A few curious neighbors holding cans of soup. Then the teenagers who thought the boat was hilarious. Then a carload of people from the next town over who had seen a post about it on a community Facebook page. By sundown, there were 40, maybe 50 people milling around my front yard, sipping red punch from plastic cups and dutifully placing cans of beans and corn on the donation table. It was working. It was actually working. Then the opposition arrived. Brenda marched down the street, flanked by 2 stern-looking men in identical navy blue blazers, her HOA board lieutenants. She was holding her clipboard, her face set in a grim mask of determination. They stopped at the edge of my property line, a clear declaration of war. A moment later, the familiar shape of a police cruiser rolled up, parking behind the news van. Officer Miller and Officer Rodriguez got out. Miller looked even more tired than usual. Rodriguez, however, had a look of sheer, unadulterated glee on his face, like a kid who had been promised a trip to the circus and found out it was coming to him. And then, the final piece. The harbinger of doom. A tow truck, the same tow truck driven by the same bored-looking Stan, rumbled to a stop at the end of the street, its yellow lights starting their slow, ominous pulse. The trap was set. The news reporter, a young woman with a microphone and a shark-like smile, immediately made a beeline for Brenda. "Ma'am, can you give us a comment? The homeowner says this is a charity art event, while the HOA claims it's a code violation. What's your side of the story?" Brenda, flustered by the camera, stammered, "This is an unapproved gathering and a flagrant violation of the community covenants. This structure is illegal." The crowd started murmuring. I knew this was my moment. Dave handed me the cheap wireless microphone we had bought at an electronics store. It crackled with static. "Showtime," he whispered. I took a deep breath, walked up the small steps to my art exhibits platform, and stood beside the bow of the sea serpent. I looked out at the crowd, my neighbors, the news camera, the cops, and Brenda's furious face. The entire ridiculous saga had led to this. "Good evening, everyone," I said into the microphone. My voice boomed unnaturally across the quiet street. "And welcome to the grand opening of the Maxwell Nautical exhibit." A smattering of polite applause. "Some of you may see a boat," I continued, patting the fiberglass hull. "Some of you, like our esteemed HOA president, may see an eyesore or a derelict vessel. But I see a story. This boat belonged to my grandfather. He was a man who worked his whole life at a desk, but he dreamed of the sea. This boat was his escape. It was his little piece of freedom in a world that's full of rules." I looked directly at Brenda. We live in a world that loves rules. Rules about what color you can paint your house, what kind of flowers you can plant, how long your grass can be. They're called covenants, bylaws, ordinances. They're meant to create harmony, but sometimes they just create beige. They sand down all the interesting edges of life until everything looks the same. The crowd was listening now. The reporter was nodding, the cameraman getting a tight shot. "This exhibit," I said, my voice rising with passion, "is not about a boat. It's about a question. Where do we draw the line? Who decides what's beautiful or valuable? And when does a rule stop protecting us and start stifling us? This boat is my edge. It's a little weird, it's a little rusty, and it doesn't quite fit. But it's mine. And I think we all deserve to have something in our lives that doesn't quite fit the mold." I raised my plastic cup of punch. "So I'd like to propose a toast to my grandfather, to weird art, to doing something stupid just to feel like you have a say in your own life, and to old Finless the catfish, wherever he may be." The crowd erupted in cheers. People were laughing and clapping. Officer Rodriguez was clapping too, before quickly stopping when he saw Miller looking at him. Even Stan, the tow truck driver, cracked a smile. Brenda was apoplectic. She marched up to Officer Miller, jabbing a finger towards me. "Officer, this is a clear violation. I demand that you shut this down and have that thing towed immediately." Officer Miller adjusted his cap, looking calmly from Brenda to the cheering crowd, to the news camera now pointed directly at him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a calm island in a sea of chaos, "I see a gathering of citizens on private property. They're not breaking any laws. He has a permit for a block party. As for the exhibit," he glanced at the boat, "that's a civil matter between you and him. We're just here to make sure everyone stays safe. It was the final nail in her coffin. Defeated and humiliated on camera, Brenda let out a sound like a deflating balloon, turned and retreated back to her house, her two blazered goons trailing behind her like defeated henchmen. Stan, seeing his authority figure vanish and having no desire to be the bad guy on the evening news, simply put his truck in gear. With a final, weary shrug in my direction, he turned the corner and rumbled off into the night. I had won. The boat, the exhibit, my ridiculous, stupid, beautiful stand. We had survived. The news story aired at 10 o'clock. It was glorious. They painted me as a quirky underdog artist fighting for creative freedom. They used the clip of my speech. They contrasted it with footage of Brenda looking furious and sputtering about aesthetic harmony. The HOA's phone number, which the station helpfully displayed on screen, was apparently flooded with calls from people who wanted to share their own HOA horror stories. The public embarrassment was too much for the HOA and, as it turned out, the city council, who didn't appreciate their quiet suburb being portrayed as a beige dystopia. My phone rang 2 days later. It was a city manager inviting me to a formal mediation meeting. I showed up with Sarah, who had graciously offered her services as pro bono counsel. On the other side of the table sat Brenda and 2 other board members, looking thoroughly miserable. The negotiation was swift. I knew I couldn't keep the boat there forever. That was an unwinnable war. But I wasn't leaving the battlefield empty-handed. We reached a compromise. I would agree to remove the Sea Serpent and its platform within 30 days. In exchange, the HOA would drop all fines and legal threats. And, in a move that was pure Sarah-inspired genius, the city agreed to install a small, official-looking historical marker on the edge of my lawn. Furthermore, the City Council announced the formation of a new Neighborhood Beautification and Arts Committee to review and approve future aesthetic guidelines. They nominated me as its first citizen representative. The look on Brenda's face when she realized she would now have to attend monthly meetings with me was a prize more valuable than any boat. The final scene of the saga took place a few weeks later. A guy who was an actual honest-to-God fisherman bought the Sea Serpent. He was thrilled with its vintage character and promised to send me a picture if he ever caught Old Finless. I used the money to pay Gus's weirdness surcharge in full and to throw a real neighborhood BBQ. No speeches, just burgers and beer. That evening, Dave, Sarah, and I were sitting on my porch looking out at the lawn. The grass was starting to grow back where the platform had been. All that remained was the plaque. It was small, bronze, and screwed to a metal post. It read, "On this site, for a brief period in 2025, stood the Sea Serpent, a temporary art installation that sparked a community-wide dialogue on rules, rebellion, and the definition of art. Let it be remembered. Res 42b." Dave took a long sip of his beer. "You know, for a guy who lost his boat, you seem pretty happy." "I didn't lose the boat, Dave," I said, a grin spreading across my face. "I immortalized it." Sarah laughed, the sound warm in the cool evening air. "So, what's next for the great artist Jerry Maxwell? Another bold statement piece?" My eyes drifted over to the side of my garage, where my old, slightly rusty push-mower sat. A familiar, mischievous glint sparked in my imagination. The blades, the engine, the weathered handle. It was a sculpture waiting to be discovered. I leaned back in my chair and looked at them, my mind already composing the placard. "I'm glad you asked," I said. "I'm calling it The Blades of Suburbia, a critique of domesticated labor. I think it needs a platform." Dave just dropped his head into his hands and groaned. The battle was over, but the artist, I knew, was just getting started.